My name is Dr. Sandra Nelson. I am an assistant teaching professor at Rutgers University, New Brunswick in the Division of Life Sciences. And today I'm going to talk to you about an experience I had in the fall 2021 semester where I taught the same course both remotely and in person. So the title of the talk is Teaching, Coinciding Remote and In-Person Courses. The objectives I have for my talk today are essentially to just tell you what I did in the fall and how I approached teaching two sections of the exact same class. I had one large group of students online of 330 and one smaller group of students in person, about 65 students. In doing so, I'll also share with you some of the data that I had on the students and how they performed throughout the semester. And finally, give you some observations that I made while teaching these two groups of students and potential improvements for my teaching as a whole as I move forward to mostly be teaching this class in person now. So I have this little cute picture of a polar bear on this slide to show you what I felt like the fall 2021 semester was. Rutgers University and many higher ed universities that semester were emerging from the fog of the coronavirus pandemic. And before fall 2021, I taught this class completely online for an entire year, almost year and a half. The spring 2020, as we all know, that semester was split in half and the second half being online. Fall 2020 and spring 2021 were all remote in addition to the summer 2021 semester. The original plan was for fall 2021 to also be remote, but then it happened that a lot of students or a lot of universities were starting to offer in-person classes, and my supervisor asked if I'd be willing to teach an in-person group of students, to which I said, absolutely, I miss teaching students in person. I love interacting with them. So in the summertime, we decided to open an in-person section. What I did was I emailed all the students that were enrolled in the course. And the course was supposed to be remote. And I said, hey, I know that, you registered for this to be a remote course, but we're going to be offering an in-person section. So if you're interested, that's available to you. So really the goal of the presentation today, as I've already mentioned, is to show you how I navigated this. I had this group of 65 students who chose to take it in person, and then most of them who chose to remain online, and how I was able to teach the same course to these two groups of students. So to back up a little bit, what is the class? What was I teaching? And what do I teach? I teach a course called Systems Physiology at Rutgers. This is an upper level course, and it is a very challenging course. In this course, we learn all about the different functions of the body, from the brain to the heart to the kidneys to the reproductive system, etc. It's a really fun class. The students overwhelmingly comment on how much they enjoy the content, but also overwhelmingly comment on how challenging the content can be in this class. It is a huge class. The enrollment is typically near 400 students per semester. And who are these students? It's an upper level class, so I almost solely get juniors and seniors enrolling for this course. The students who are exercise science majors are required to take my course, and that's the only major that requires systems physiology. But I get a huge variety of other majors that are interested in taking the course because the course is a prerequisite for a lot of health science professions. So I have plenty of biology, cell biology, neuroscience majors, psychology, public health, genetics, cognitive science. Really, I get a catch-all group of students who are juniors and seniors taking this as an elective, in addition to the exercise science students taking it as a requirement. That is a lot of fun because you get students with different backgrounds and who bring different perspectives into the course. But of course, as you might imagine, can present a lot of challenges as well because they come with different backgrounds and have different knowledge on certain topics, some stronger than others. The career goals of the students, I'd say 2/3 or more of my students have pre-health career goals, whether they're pre-med, pre-dental, pre-PA, physician assistant, pre-PT, physical therapy, nursing, etc. Also still have plenty of students like exercise science who are interested in like the performance side of thing or personal training, and then other students that are interested in grad school and things like that as well. But that's the gist of who we're dealing with here. And as if you're not aware, like pre-medical students can be a little needy at times and a little high maintenance, we'll say. So that is just a challenge of the course in general. And then in this fall 2021 semester, when I had both groups of students, that challenge, was accelerated a little bit. So another thing, as we're continuing to just talk a little bit about the course before I dive into how I did this differently in the remote and the in-person sections. The things that determine the grade in this class is a big class. So in general, most of the points come from multiple choice tests. In particular, 3 exams worth 15% each, a cumulative final worth 20%, and then about 35% of what I call fluffy points, which are points that the students, in general should get close to 100% on. I'll talk a little bit more about these different categories as I show you some data a little bit later. But the weekly quizzes were designed to be a little bit harder than the concept check quizzes. And the exams and the cumulative final exam, the bulk of their grade. So what I'd like to do in the next few slides then is describe first how I ran the class remotely, which was what I was used to at the time since I had done it for the last year, and then how I decided to run the class in person while still having this remote section. Okay. This meme might be inappropriate or not, I don't know, but it made me chuckle because I have a son who definitely said "Ma the cheese stick" during remote learning. I think he says "mommy," but close enough. All right. So remote learning, we've all been doing it for a while, thanks to the coronavirus pandemic. So I optimized, I think, this class fairly well online. And the way that the students received the material is that they were to listen to 4 lectures per week on their own time, asynchronously. These were called mini lectures because the lectures ranged in time from 25 to 45 minutes. So I didn't make them as long as a typical in-person 80-minute lecture, but instead tried to break them into smaller bits. So the students would have to listen to 2 lectures that would be have a quiz covered on it on a Monday, and then another 2 lectures on a Thursday, and have a quiz that Thursday due on those 2 lectures. So they could really listen to it anytime they wanted to. It was asynchronous delivery of the course content. However, I didn't want the course to be completely asynchronous. I wanted to have a component where the students were required to meet with me, where I could also take attendance. So I also had them meet me 2 times per week for 1 hour on a Monday and a Thursday. And in these Zoom meetings, we would discuss the recorded lectures. I'd say, okay, today you guys watch the 2 lectures on whatever, cross-bridge cycling and this and the muscle. And now we're going to talk more in depth about that. Or this is a topic in this lecture that students generally have trouble with. Let's talk about that a little more. And I would do Zoom polls, and I would do different types of ways of rearranging the material for them that we call organizers in those 2 1 hours per week with the remote students. The attendance was required there. So up here is a schematic of how I put this on the syllabus, how I told the remote students to approach their weeks in my course. So you can see Monday and Thursday are kind of the heavy days where they should have at least listened to the lectures. They come to our class discussion that I was just describing to you, and they have a quiz due that evening on those 2 lectures. So you can't just put off the lectures because you have to do this quiz, although I do think they've found ways to put off the lectures. And then on Thursday, same kind of routine as Monday. And then for the students, both in person and remotely, they had a quiz that was due on Sunday that covered the content for the entire week. Listed on this calendar are 2 optional office hours, which are more just like group, time for them to come in if they'd like to. On Tuesdays and Fridays, those were on Zoom, and those were available to the remote students. There was also an in-person office hour offered on Mondays and Thursdays that was also available to the remote students. I just didn't put it on this calendar. So that was the week for the remote kids. And I think as I start to describe the in-person kids, the one huge difference here is that they had a chance to review material with me. So in person, I imagine that the students took the class in person because they didn't want to listen to online lectures anymore. So I did not ask them to do that. Instead, I delivered the course content live in class at our 9 a.m. class and made the attendance required at that point for them. So while the remote students were getting this lecture material delivered in online videos asynchronously, the in-person students were getting live 80-minute lectures. I didn't want the in-person students to be at a disadvantage, though, because the discussions that I had with the online students were really helpful. So all the materials that I used to run those discussions, the organizers, the practice questions, I would give those materials to the in-person students, and I would tell them, hey, I worked on these materials with the online class. I think it's a great way to study the stuff we learned in class today. And even sometimes if I had time in class, I would go over some of those discussion materials with the in-person students as well. So same calendar, but this is just tweaked a little bit for the in-person students. You can again see that Mondays and Thursdays are the big days where they had to come to class, attendance required, and then by the end of that day had to answer a 10-question quiz online about the concepts that were covered in class that day. And on this calendar, you can see all 4 office hours that were available per week. On Mondays and Thursdays, an in-person one at 1 o'clock, and on Tuesdays and Fridays, online office hour at 11 o'clock. They, like the remote students, also had a weekly quiz due on Sundays. So now that I've given an overview of how I chose to run both the remote and the in-person class, I'd like to just summarize some of the similarities and differences before I show you how they performed. So the number and the mode of office hours offered, 2 in-person, 2 online, was the same for both classes. The volume of the material covered, we're doing this many lectures on muscle, this many lectures on heart, that was the same between the 2 groups, as well as the pace. And I'll make an asterisk there with the pace because I found that doing this live to the in-person students, I felt like I was going too fast. So as a potential improvement, something I'll mention at the end, I'd like to work with the content in this class in better pacing because I did feel very rushed with the in-person students trying to keep up with my online videos and the online class. The students took the exam on the same day. I'm going to talk more about what the exam questions looked like, but they had to take the exam at the same time. And then as already mentioned, how the grade was determined, again, 45% test, 20% final, yada, yada, that I mentioned before, that was the same between both sections. So some of the key differences that were mentioned as I was describing how I ran both sections, obviously the way I get to interact with the students. The remote students largely interacted with me via Zoom unless they decided to attend an in-person office hour. And I got to be face-to-face with the in-person students, and even more since there was only 65 of them, got to actually know their names and know most of them quite well during the semester. The mode of the content delivery was very different between the 2 sections. The in-person students got it live, as mentioned already, while the online students had to watch it asynchronously in the form of 4 mini lectures per week. I made required scheduled reviews each week for the remote class, and those are not a part of my part of the in-person class. So this third difference here, I think, was maybe the biggest one, and one that I would I wish I would have had a better workaround for, but my workaround was to give the in-person students the same documents that I used for the remote class, but I think that was a key difference there. And as I'll describe in a few minutes, the exam questions varied. I kind of changed it up every exam to kind of mess around and experimentally play around with this a little bit, but the exam questions were not always the same between the 2 sections. And the mode of delivery of the exam was not the same. You've got a remote group of students taking an exam online, and you have an in-person group of students taking an exam in a lecture hall, very different modes of exam delivery. So before I talk a little more about the exams, which is pretty interesting, just some kind of general quantitative data, if you will, and none of this data is like statistically analyzed, so just looking at my spreadsheets and giving some information about what I saw. The retention between the 2 groups was pretty good. Pretty high, up in the 94 to 97% range. And then the number of students that failed, again, I didn't do any statistics, but only 1 out of the 63 that remained in the in-person class ended up failing, whereas we had 16 of the 330, and the percentage here I think is more important, closer to 5% of the remote class failing the course. And I think this, could it be an artifact of there just being more students in the remote class? Sure. But I also think it is because in a remote class, it's a lot easier to just fall off the wagon and stop doing the work. And certainly of those 16 that failed, many of them had stopped doing the work well before the final exam. So how to approach the exams was a big chunk of this because the exams are the majority of their grade. These are pre-med students who are obsessed with getting A's and getting great grades on their exams. So I really wanted to be fair in how I delivered the exam to these two groups of students. So I'm going to just slide through these two, the advantage and disadvantage here, and then speak to them. So I think we all know, as we've been teaching online a lot, the advantage of taking an online exam is that the students are not right in front of you. So you really don't know what they're doing. And I never tried to police that. I never used a lockdown browser or any kind of Proctor Track software. I told online students before the semester, I said, you can use your book and your notes. You need to do your own work, whether they were or not. I didn't police that. But you can use your book and your notes. This is the advantage of an online exam. Okay. Now, I knew the in-person students weren't going to have that advantage, and I knew they were concerned about that. Like, the online students get their book and notes, and we don't. Okay, so the way that I mediated that, kind of, if it's the best way I could think of, was that I gave the in-person students a lot of time. I gave them between 70 and 75 minutes to complete a 40-question test. The test is not designed to be more than an hour. And the online students, I trumped their time I made it so it was a very strict time limit. They only had 60 minutes to do the 40 questions. Truly beyond 60 minutes, they would just be spending more time Googling or trying to figure out the answers, right? So I kind of lumped that here on this slide as showing the advantage for the in-person classes. They had enough time, plenty of time. They never felt rushed on the test. And then the advantage for the remote class is they have their notes. So the disadvantage, obviously no book. For the in-person class, no notes, no Control F. And then the disadvantage for the remote class is that I make the test end at 60 minutes, and they definitely complained about that and continue to do so. So how I approached the questions was also kind of weighing on me, like, should I give them the same exact questions? So for exam one, I decided to make them different. I had 26 that were the same, but 14 that were different. And my rationale here is a straightforward memorization question, like, what does this hormone do? That is a perfectly plausible, good question for an in-person class. If I say that to an online class, what does this hormone do? That is a 5-second Google, and they have the answer. They didn't need to study or learn that at all, right? So I really try to avoid those straightforward Googleable questions when I write online exams in general, and kept that in mind here as I was writing the exam for these two groups of students. So in exam one, was the online or the remote classes exam a little harder? Possibly, because I didn't include a couple of those just more straightforward questions, but at the same time, they had their notes. So that's what I did for exam one. In exam two, whether it was laziness or exhaustion on my part, I decided to let's give them both the same test. And I tried to eliminate as much of those straightforward questions as I could. So I gave them the same test. I was also curious to see if the average would be the same between the two groups if I gave them the same test. And I did not tell them they were getting the same test either. And then exam three, I kind of went in the middle where I gave some different questions, but mostly all the same. So how'd it go? So that exam one that I was mentioning, where they were the most different, the two exams, you see there is the most different average score, right? An average of 70 for the in-person class and 64 for the remote class. When I made all questions the same as in exam two, you see that difference goes down, but the in-person class still had a higher average than the remote class, not by a lot, but they did. And exam three, a little bit even closer together yet with the remote class near 65, so only about a 1.2 point difference there. And then the final exam scores, I'm not going to spend time talking about how I designed the final exam, though I do think it was a tad easier. For the in-person class, I tried to kind of help them out maybe a little more because they didn't have their notes. But also one thing I want to point out here underneath the yellow highlighted average numbers are the ranges. Especially with exam three, note the range in the in-person class, 40 to 87.5. And the range to the online class or the remote class, which was 28 to 97. So in general, if you look at the remote class, you'll see that they have higher high scores. And I think this is from the good students who are taking it remotely. They can really work on those really hard questions because they can get the really easy questions, and then they spend the rest of their time on an online test digging for the right answer. Whereas the in-person class, they either know it or they don't, it's in their head, and then they need to turn it in, right? Because there's no notes or Google or online papers to consult during the test. So that was some of the exam data. Here's some of the other grades that were taken in the course. Nothing major to really highlight on this slide, I think, other than you can see the overall grade so it's the last row here, was 2 points higher in the in-person class. Their attendance was a little bit better as well. Concept check quiz is about the same and up to the top with the weekly quizzes, about a point higher. Those weekly quizzes were the ones done on Sunday that would cover material from the entire week. And they were a little bit harder than the concept check quizzes. So, you look at this. Again, I didn't do statistics on this, but in this fall 2021 group, the in-person class performed better than the remote class. Some qualitative, so just some observations I made that aside from the numbers, the attendance got worse in both groups. Maybe I'm no good and they don't like listening to me. I don't know. Maybe that's just an artifact of how the semester goes for a lot of people. But I noticed more and more as the attendance was getting worse. And I'm not sure if this is just the students feeling burnt out or relying too much on online recordings. But yeah, I noticed that in both groups. I think an important key here too, for at least this particular semester, was that the in-person class was at 9 a.m. and that's early for the college students. And I think that group ended up being self-selected because these are students that are motivated enough to be in a classroom by 9 a.m. So it's probably going to select for a little bit more elite group of students than, say, if that in-person class was offered at 2 p.m. or something. I'm not sure, but that was my inkling as I was looking at this data and as I interacted with the students who were there at 9 a.m. Who came to office hours? Also an interesting just sort of qualitative observation. If we're looking at percentage of students that came to office hours, the in-person students had a higher percentage attendance at office hours. There were several online students that were there all the time as well, the remote students, many fantastic remote students too. But if we're looking at percentage, who showed up more from the in-person class. So some conclusions and / improvements as I move forward in my teaching. I think that I felt, once the semester was concluded, that it was possible to effectively run this course in person and remotely, and not necessarily at the same time. That wasn't great. I'd prefer not to do that again. However, it's possible. And even during the whole pandemic, I think many of us learned that teaching remotely is possible. One of the experiments just sort of that I had in the back of my mind with this semester is, do I really think one of these is better than the other? So I'll talk about that right at the end. But high scores will be higher on the online exam. So that's what I was mentioning when we were looking at the range of those exam scores. The students that took the exams online, I had some very bright students in my remote class. I think they really had a chance to really work on those hard questions and had a real legit shot at getting 100 on an exam, where that's not quite as possible in an in-person exam where you don't have access to your notes. The in-person students, generally speaking, did slightly better on their exams and in terms of their overall grade, as we saw with the numbers. And I think a lot of that was due to the artifact of motivated students being willing to take a 9 a.m. class. So again, back to sort of my original bullet point here. I do think that different modes of learning can work for different types of students. However, the human interactions that you're able to have in an in-person course, I can walk up the stairs in a lecture hall and say hello and look at a person's eyes, and that's just hard to replicate remotely. And I really missed that and was very happy to be back with the students in fall 2021. Personally, I really love that. But I do also acknowledge and recognize that for some students, life circumstances, etc., remote learning is a better option. And I think that can also be effectively done, especially if questions are written the right way. And in terms of an improvement or something that I really noticed this entire semester is I really felt rushed with my in-person students. And that's because I was trying to keep pace with the course that I designed with asynchronous delivery of the material. So something I'd like to work on moving forward is to really take a look at the content, the material itself, and think about maybe ways to pare some of it down so I can do more review with students when I have them in person and just have less rushing happening there. And at this point, I'd ask questions if there were any, but this is a recording, so there's not. But I did do this for my husband, and I asked him to give me a question or something, and now I don't really remember what that was. So thank you for your attention. Appreciate it.